Management 570. We're going to talk about all different varieties of diversity, some of the challenges we have in managing it, and also address some really important topics like privilege and where does privilege play a role in how we manage our employees and what the expectations are around what they should or shouldn't be doing or what their experiences are. Diversity isn't just the visible demographic characteristics that we typically think of. They are certainly important, and they're an important part of diversity, but diversity is bigger than that. As you can see from this graphic, personality is at the core of how people truly differ. They differ in the way they think about risk, they differ in their internal locus of control, they differ in their personality types and with respect to how they make decisions and how comfortable they are with ambiguity, all sorts of issues around that. So fundamentally, personality is one of the largest issues of diversity and diversity management that we don't really think about. We sort of take it for granted that people will be different, but we don't really think about what the impact is on how these different personalities, work together or, compete with each other for having an impact on the organization. Internal dimensions tend to be the factors that we think about most of the time when we're thinking about issues of diversity. It's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, or really sex, gender presentation, age, things like this, someone's physical ability. These are all visible. These all have a very definitive way of differentiating people's points of view, the lens, the way that they see the world. And really the way I like to think about these internal dimensions is they are a proxy for the way that I experience the world and that the world experiences me. Because I may be a different race than somebody else, I experience the world in one way and they experience it in a very different way. So there's this tension, if you will. There is not one reality, if you want to, get down to that in terms of how things are seen and should be interpreted. I mean, the bottom line is we all view the world through the lens of our experiences and our personality and things like that. So it informs, how we might be different and how we might be perceived as different. Even larger than, say, these internal dimensions are things like our external dimensions, what we like to do, what our parenting status is, whether we're married or single, how much work experience we have, what religious beliefs we have. Much of this is driven by personality and it may be influenced by some of these internal dimensions, but some of these external dimensions are different in and of themselves from personality and my age or my gender or my sexual orientation. So the external dimensions are also a fundamental way that people differ. And again, these external dimensions influence that lens that we use to see the world. And because of that, we all have different interpretations of what's in front of us. Lastly is the organizational dimensions, and these organizational dimensions are getting at where we are in the company, whether we're management or whether we're the employees or whether we're in the manufacturing department or the marketing department. We see the world differently. We see the organization and its motives very differently depending on the perspective that we're in. So what's the overall lesson, to take away from this? Diversity is a complex construct. It's not simply about the color of one's skin or where they grew up or whether or not they love men or they love women. The bottom line is diversity is about how we differ on all sorts of individual differences and all sorts of dimensions. And we have to respect that the point of view that someone brings to the table may be based on their race. It may be based on their religion. It may be based on whether or not they're union or management. But all of these factors come into play and create all sorts of opportunities, but also challenges in the way that we manage the people in our organization. So when we talk about diversity management, what specifically does that mean? It means a whole lot of different things, and it starts with diversity training. How do we train people to be aware of individual differences, of different points of view, different perspectives? The most important thing for me in diversity training isn't just oh, hey, this is what, an African American person's experience is versus someone who's Latino versus, a lesbian versus a straight white male. That's great, and it's important at one level. But what's really much more important in diversity training, and where I think personally the focus needs to be on diversity training, is how do we deal with these differences? How do we deal with the conflict that goes along with it? How do we communicate with each other and leave ourselves open for communication with folks who might think differently than we do? So for me, when I think about diversity training, it isn't enough to just say, well, this is what it's like to be Black, or this is what it's like to be Latino. It's also about, how do we talk to each other and how do we resolve conflicts based on the variety of differences that we're going to be experiencing in an organization. Diversity management also means that diversity as a strategy needs to be part of the overall business strategy, that it needs top management team support, and it needs to be embedded not only in the company's corporate strategy, but it needs to be embedded in the company policies that go in to reinforce how important diversity is to companies. And so companies have the best of intentions when they're thinking about, well, we want a diverse company, but they don't have the policies and practices and procedures and the strategy that reinforces diversity as an important part of their business plan. My guess would be, and I don't have the numbers on this, but my guess would be the companies that really think of HR as more of a strategic partner are more likely to value diversity and diversity management than, say, companies who only think of HR as, an expense center. Because then for them it all comes down to the numbers, and it's not really about the intangibles of what diversity can bring to a company. Diversity management is also about thinking of affirmative action and what affirmative action means. The lecture on the legal issues addresses what is affirmative action, but affirmative action can be a voluntary program as well. It doesn't have to be something that's necessarily legislated by the law or by an executive order. So a company can be engaged in doing affirmative action because they think it's the right thing to do. So it can be a part of diversity management, is doing the best you can to attract the qualified individuals to your pool. So you have a pool of the most qualified, diverse people that you can access. On top of that, diversity management is also about the legal compliance. There's no getting around that. So much of the law is built around how do we manage diversity that it's really important that we know the laws and pay attention to the laws. Hence, these two topics are linked together, for this week, because they feed off of each other. Lastly, it's about awareness. We can train people how to deal with conflict. We can train them on the facts. This is what it's like to have this experience. But we need to get people eventually to a place where they recognize that differences are to be respected, not necessarily feared. Yes, we all are different at so many fundamental levels. Even if you have a room full of all white males, and they're all still going to have a whole variety of different opinions and perspectives on things. So there's not a one-size-fits-all on what people think and how they should behave, and we have to be careful of the stereotypes that are around that. But fundamentally speaking, in terms of diversity awareness, we want to make sure that our employees are aware of that there are differences, and that these differences aren't just manifested in things like race or sex or gender presentation or sexual orientation, that diversity and respect for diverse opinions has to be something that's modeled. And so we have to allow for conflict and allow for differences of opinions without it resulting in, factions in the company and tearing the company apart. There are arguments for diversity management and the importance of diversity management. There are also arguments against paying attention to issues of diversity. And I'm going to talk about both, and also talk about how we can counter some of the arguments for why diversity shouldn't be a consideration. To start with, in terms of the arguments for, the U.S. itself is much more diverse. We already know Latinos are the fastest growing population out there. White individuals or Caucasian individuals are going to be in the minority in due time, representing less than 50% of people here in the United States. And so because the U.S. is diverse, because organizations are diverse, or the work pool. The workplace is the workforce is diverse. The U.S. organizations should also be diverse. So let me rephrase that again. Because the population is diverse and the workforce is diverse, organizations should also reflect that diversity. And also reflect the diversity of their particular area. You certainly can't ask an organization that's in the middle of farm country in northern Wisconsin that they need to have an enormous amount of diversity there, because if in that community there's not a lot of diversity, it's really difficult for them to reflect a wide variety of diverse individuals and diverse perspectives. So we have to be very careful, when we think about organizations need to be diverse, yes, but they need to be diverse relative to the labor market within which they are pulling their employees. And so, if you have an all-white company in East St. Louis where it's mostly African American, that's a problem. If you have, an all-black company in an area where it's primarily Latino, it's also going to be the same problem. Your community is going to feel resentment that they have not been tapped into for job opportunities in that area, and hence that's why we do a lot more affirmative action to attract these diverse people to our company. Another argument for diversity is that managing diversity in a good way results in lower turnovers for minorities, and that's in fact true. When we really pay attention to these as important issues, minorities are more likely to stay. They have more loyalty for the company, and that's really important. Same thing with having a commitment to the overall company. And lower turnover and higher commitment go hand in hand. If I have higher commitment to the company, particularly because I believe in what they're doing and it matters to me, then I'm less likely to have an inclination to leave, to turn over. We also find, too, that when a company is really actively trying to do the right thing in terms of having diverse ideas and managing conflict and diverse people in their company, and not just based on demographics, but all of those dimensions, we find that there's fewer lawsuits because people are more willing to talk through issues and less likely to shoot from the hip and say, well, I'm going to sue you and go from there. When we treat people adversarial, we're more likely to have lawsuits. But when we treat people with the perspective that we need to talk to each other, then and respect those differences, we are much more likely to have fewer problems with lawsuits. We also know that diversity widens the talent pool. I think that makes absolute sense, perfect mathematical sense. When you have a broader talent pool that you're pulling from, all different groups, you will find that the talent pool increases in quality. It's not just about the diversity, but it's also about increasing in quality. You get the best of the best, period. And if you're broadening that your search, you're not limiting yourself to just this one group or just that group. You're opening up to all groups to find the best person for the job. That's really the goal. Lastly, there's an argument that diversity initiatives can help drive business growth. And to some extent it can, obviously within limited parameters. And we'll talk about some of those arguments against this discussion in the next slide. But the argument for diversity basically says when we have diverse customers do care about the diversity of their company. And what we see this so much more now with social conscience funds, right? Social conscious funds, where we really care about the mission, vision, triple bottom line perspective of the companies that we invest in. We know, for example, that Southwest Airlines is really big on human resource management. We know that Starbucks is really good on helping their employees get education and paying fair wages to the people who they are buying their products from. So yeah, our cup of coffee costs $3 to $5, but we also know we're paying a fair wage to the people who are growing the coffee beans, right? So we know there's a trade-off there. And we also know that there's plenty of investors out there that are willing to invest in companies, and plenty of people who use their purchasing dollars as a vote for whether or not they like the company's business policies. Is that true for everybody? No, not necessarily at all. But there is a growing variety of people, regardless of whether they are consistent with your religious values or whether they're consistent with social justice issues or environmental issues. There is a growing customer base that cares about those sorts of issues, and they vote with their dollars in terms of whether or not they invest in the company or whether they even buy the company's products. What else do we see with business growth? When we manage diversity well, and it has to be managed well, we do see greater creativity and problem solving because we've got multiple perspectives that are being focused on some of these issues that we're challenged with in the organization. So when there's more creativity and problem solving, it usually comes from the fact that we've given people the tools how to communicate well with each other and manage the conflict and the differences that are naturally going to arise. Lastly, the issue of flexibility. If we are more sensitive to differences, we can expand globally in terms of our customer base and our employee base, and that gives us greater flexibility to meet market demands and market needs. Particularly as we have a global economy now and not just a domestic economy, it's pretty clear that we need to have the ability to bring in people who are different and unique and comfortable with all sorts of different perspectives. And there's a great advantages to people who are really comfortable with a more global perspective on things. And as I said, just as we have arguments for diversity, there are ample arguments against focusing on diversity as a strategic initiative. Many of these arguments can be counterbalanced, but nonetheless, it's important to be aware that not all people value diversity, not all people believe there's value in differences, and we need to be aware of that. So one of the first arguments is that a diverse workforce doesn't always mean more productivity, and that's absolutely true. If we don't manage the conflict, or what we call the process losses of having diverse groups, greater conflict, the greater time to make decisions, sometimes the greater cost and greater training to get these diverse groups to work together. If we don't manage that well, yes, you're right, it will not result in greater productivity. In fact, it may decrease our productivity because we're too busy fighting and battling each other. Number two, that results of diversity efforts are not easy to measure. That's correct, they're not, because a lot of times the impact of diversity is more intangible. It can't be measured with a hard and fast, we are more profitable because, or we are more productive because. A lot of the benefits of diversity is more about culture and person organization match and fitting in and being comfortable and being part of a company culture that works for me. And so given that, it's essential that we recognize or communicate to those who are in power that diversity efforts aren't always going to result in a tangible measurement of outcome, that there are more intangibles involved in terms of what the morale is like for the company or the company culture. And they may not have short-term benefits, but the longer-term benefits are there for sure. But clearly, yes, that's definitely a challenge. Number three, diverse employees don't always embrace diversity initiatives. Correct, there is a big anti-affirmative action backlash among many minorities because there's the presumption that the only reason why they got ahead was because of affirmative action. Again, this comes from a misunderstanding of what affirmative action really is. Affirmative action is about ensuring we have a workforce that's prepared, that everybody gets opportunity. I think it's a fallacy to assume that people from all socioeconomic backgrounds and from all regions of the country have access to the same quality of education and resources. I mean, you can see this in St. Louis alone, right? We don't even need to get into that. That there are groups that have greater opportunities with great, strong schools, and we have groups that have not made them have available to them those same kinds of resources. So a lot of people who are diverse amongst themselves don't like the idea that affirmative action, sort of means that they had to be given a leg up, that they didn't do it on their own. You have to do it on your own. Yes, affirmative action attracts a wide variety of quality people to the company, and that's what affirmative action needs to be, affirmatively recruiting diverse people, and diverse people including white males. But the challenge is then the people have to compete on their own. They have to be able to do that. And if we find that these groups are not competing, then we have to look at why aren't they able to compete. It's not because they are less capable. A lot of times it's because they don't have the same resources and opportunities available to them as sort of the white Caucasian majority group has. So the goal here is, we want to make sure people are aware that affirmative action isn't about giving people opportunities or that they didn't deserve. We're not hiring people who are unqualified. right? I mean, everybody still has to fight, and they still have to compete, and they still have to do work. But that's absolutely true. A lot of diverse individuals, and Clarence Thomas is one in particular that comes to mind, who doesn't like the idea of affirmative action, and he feels like it sort of belittles, the efforts of those who, sort of fight to get ahead, for themselves. So that's the concern. But again, when not all people in those diverse minority groups also still have access to the same resources and the same, advantages, and they don't always have a parent, or somebody who's looking out for them that pushes them along to succeed. And a lot of times institutional racism and institutional sexism and things like that create barriers for a lot of folks. No matter how hard they try to get ahead, it's still, they still get, hit these brick walls. And so I can appreciate that a lot of these groups don't want to embrace something like this because it feels like their efforts are minimized. But in fact, I think what it demonstrates is it gets them the opportunity to be on the level playing field, given that there are some structural and societal imbalances in the way education resources are distributed. Next thing, the diversity training may not add value to the organization. Exactly. And I think I made that point in the previous slide, one of the previous slides, that diversity training and diversity management has to be broader than simply, here's what it's like to be Black, and here's what it's like to be Latino, and here's what it's like to be a lesbian. It has to be broader than that. It has to be about, why do we differ? On what ways do we differ? For getting people to recognize that just because it's not in your experience doesn't mean it's not a valuable perspective or point of view. And we'll get into talking about privilege in a little bit. But so diversity training, if it only focuses on demographic differences, is a waste to companies. The diversity training needs to be broader. It needs to deal with conflict management. It needs to be able to deal with how do we communicate to each other and deal with these issues. If we don't deal with these issues, that's the problem we're going to run into. And absolutely, if all we do is scapegoat white males, and that's not going to help us either. Our goal is making sure that diversity training is open to everybody and that it addresses not just the descriptors, but also the real fundamental problems of what it means to be diverse and the challenges that we face when we're diverse, which is the communication and the conflict. Next, the diverse markets may not care who's selling to them, and that's absolutely true. There are some customers who care, and there are some customers who absolutely do not care. It doesn't matter to them whatsoever, and so they buy whatever they want, or they think about it whatever they want, and it doesn't really matter to them, who made it or how diverse the company is. So, that's absolutely true. There are some diverse markets that really just don't care. White male bashing is not inclusive and is divisive. Absolutely, hands down. For me, diversity management is about making sure everybody is included, and diversity means everybody. Does that mean that we only make sure white males have opportunities? No. Does it mean we only make sure women have opportunities? No. Same thing with any of the other protected groups, as we would call them. We want to make sure that we're not blaming the entire white straight male population for historical discrimination that occurs and societal discrimination that occurs. No one's to blame. Everybody wants opportunities, everybody wants to work hard, but I think what people have to recognize is white males don't have to work the same way that women have to, for example, for legitimacy, or that minority males have to work for legitimacy in the workplace. And it's not to shame white males in that context, but it's to also recognize that white male experience is very different than an African American female experience. It's just fundamentally different because of those racial and sex-based perceptions and the perceptions that people have around that. So, but going back to my point, we cannot bash one group, because if we are bashing one group in lieu of supporting others, all we're doing is creating the same problem that existed before, which is that, we're discriminating against a group of folks who, don't deserve to be discriminated against because of their sex, because of their race. There is this basic assumption that I think a lot of people have, that we're all kind of, embracing the same perspective when it comes to issues of diversity. But even among people who are comfortable with diversity, there's a wide variety of comfort, in managing diversity. And for some people, it's good enough that you recognize people are different and you don't go any further than that. And for others, it's about how do I integrate this, into my life and being able to easily shift different frames of reference so quickly and easily. Most people are on a continuum of diversity awareness, and understand that when you do diversity training or when you try to develop diversity initiatives in your company, you're not talking to a group of people who are lockstep in their beliefs. You've got some people who are very comfortable with it and some people who are absolutely uncomfortable with it. So I want to go through what this continuum looks like and perhaps think about some of the implications for that. Number one, the people that are in denial. These are the people with the least sensitivity to issues of diversity, and in fact they live so isolated from other cultures and from other groups that what we see is they don't believe anybody that's not in their culture or in their group to be even worthwhile. White supremacists are a great example of this. These people are in absolute denial. If you're non-white, non-male, your existence really doesn't matter. You are sort of subhuman, or you are less than valuable. The only group that matters is, white males in that particular world. And we could see this in all sorts of other perspectives. I mean, one could even argue that some of the religious zealots and extremists, will live in that perspective where it's not about being defensive, but it's about being in absolute denial. If you don't believe what I believe, therefore there is no value to you, so I will eliminate you. And that's sort of a lot of what the bombing, the suicide bombers are about, right? So moving on to defensive. Defensive folks are kind of like the Archie Bunker. If you remember the old sitcom from the 70s, All in the Family, Archie Bunker was fearful of all the changes that were going on in his world. And because he was fearful of these changes, he engaged in stereotyping, that he had negative attributions for these groups mostly because he feared them. So he sees them as different, but he doesn't like the different. Why can't they just be like me? You can be black, but you have to think like I do. You can be Latino, and you have to think like I do. There's no recognition that there are unique experiences attached to these different identities, if you will. So people who are defensive typically engage in stereotypes. They are very us versus them, and a lot of times that comes out of fear of difference, fear of something that's not quite like the way I am. And so that's obviously a big concern there. When we move up to the minimization group, again, the minimization group assumes that everybody's really the same. Now we move from the defensive mode, is where we see people, but we see them as really different, and that difference is not good. We move to minimization, where we see people as all the same. And on one level, this is the group of people that says, hey, you bleed like I bleed, you breathe and put your pants on the same way I do, and so therefore you're a human being. Absolutely. We are human beings, but we are still human beings with very, very differing perspectives and influences and things like that. So minimization folks are really making the effort to embrace diverse others, but a lot of times it comes from diverse others who, we should all be the same, right? We expect everybody to be cut from the same cloth and see the world in the same way, and just as we bleed in the same way, we assume our experiences are the same, and they're not. And I had my own personal experience with this when I was growing up. I was previously married, and my ex-husband was African American, and his mother was also African American. His father was Russian, white Russian Jewish man. Anyway, she was telling me this story, relating the story, how she and her husband at the time, who again was a white male, older white male, and she was traveling with him from New York City to Washington, D.C. And the question that she had, the situation that she posed to me was, so I was telling him that if we didn't eat before we left Philadelphia, because they were driving down the highway, through Philadelphia and on their way south, said if we didn't eat in Philadelphia, we wouldn't be able to eat until we got to Washington, D.C. And I looked at her with some incredulity, and I thought, There's tons of restaurants between Philadelphia and DC. Why wouldn't they be able to eat in those restaurants? And she, so I asked her the question, and she very slyly smiled at me and winked and nodded and said, well, there was a thing called Jim Crow. We were not allowed to sit in the restaurant at the same table. I would have had to sit in the back and he could sit up front. So there was no place for us to eat together anytime we left south of Philadelphia, because that would have been south of the Mason-Dixon line. And at that moment, I realized that as much as I felt like I was this great person because I said, oh, I accept everybody and it doesn't matter, I had forgotten that my experience of the world was very different than her experience of the world. It was not relevant to me to think about Jim Crow because it wasn't my experience. So, of course, I wouldn't have thought that Jim Crow mattered because it didn't matter to me. It wasn't part of my life. And it was at that moment that I recognized this idea that minimizing differences, that we are all just the same, quote unquote, only goes so far. We are all the same in that we're all humans and we deserve to be treated as humans. But the way that we differ based on race or sex or orientation and all these sorts of things, our experiences of the world are very different. And we have to recognize that our experiences of the world are very different because of that. So moving then up, out of those ethnocentric perspectives, the denial, defensive, and minimization perspectives, to ethno-relativistic perspectives, the acceptance, adaptation, and integration. These are perspectives. The ethno-relativistic perspective says, that there is goodness in all perspectives, if you will, that not one culture is right and the other cultures are wrong. So an acceptance perspective, which is the lowest level of ethno-relativism, basically says we recognize and we see these differences, that we are pretty tolerant of these differences. It doesn't bother us. We address the challenges. We recognize that just because we have different perspectives doesn't mean we have to agree and doesn't mean we have to fight. We can still respect each other. That's sort of the bare minimum, you kind of need in that area of acceptance. People who are in adaptation mode are much more focused on really getting to know their own culture but other cultures and really shifting their frame of reference very intentionally. So it's like, okay, now I'm in this place and now I have to think like these people would think and behave like these people would behave. They start to empathize and they take other people's perspectives. They can really start to learn how to walk in someone else's shoes. That adaptation mode is really important, particularly if you want to work in a global organization. You really do have to have the ability to see the world through a different lens than you're used to doing. Lastly is the integration mode, which is where people can very fastly and very easily interpret and evaluate things in a whole variety of cultural frames, that they don't really see a worldview as this one right worldview, that they really see worldviews as sort of more of this collective construct, and that people very easily shift directions between different frames of reference. They get it at a real fundamental level. So people who grow up in foreign countries and who have the ability to travel from country to country and culture to culture tend to be more in the adaptation and integration level of diversity awareness because they've grown up with this idea that there's tons of differences, across the board in terms of diversity. So the important lesson to take away from this idea of diversity awareness continuum is that when you're trying to do these interventions in your workplace, or you're trying to think about how can I get my company to be more diverse, understand that not everybody's in the same place with their level of comfort around diversity. And while you may never get your denial people to be comfortable with others, you can work on your defensive and minimizing folks to really get them to a place to be minimally accepting of these differences. And that's a big part of what we need to do and what we need to think about in terms of diversity awareness.